Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is tremendous. It's so wonderful to see everybody here this afternoon on this very, very special occasion. I see lots of members of the university community here, lots of members of the Saskatoon community, students, faculty, university supporters, people who are interested in seeing our guest of honor today and hearing from him and the wonderful things that he will have to tell us. I know His Worship Mayor Charlie Clark is here. I see him in the audience. Thank you very much, sir, for being here. And everybody, it's wonderful to see such a great turnout. As we always say at this university, on important gathering occasions, we're gathered here. We acknowledge that we're gathered here on Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to our First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationships with one another. We are holding this very special forum as one of our University of Saskatchewan Canada 150 initiatives, projects that aim to celebrate the university's achievements over our 110-year history, and also to envision a future that truly reflects who we are as a community and as Canadians. We are excited to be bringing 3 former Prime Ministers of Canada to our campus over the next few weeks to reflect on where we've come from and where we are headed. And we're absolutely delighted that our first guest is the Right Honourable Jean Chretien. Speaking of nation builders, it is worth noting that in this Canada 150 year, the University of Saskatchewan has contributed many nation builders. For example, John Diefenbaker, one of our graduates and a former chancellor of this university, introduced Canada's first federal Bill of Rights in 1960, laying the foundation for what became Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Because this university was so important to him, he even willed that his body lay in state right here in Convocation Hall. Emmett Hall, another of our graduates, is widely recognized as the father of Canada's Medicare system. As a Supreme Court justice, one of his most influential judicial legacies was a dissenting opinion that recognized Indigenous title to traditional lands. Both Diefenbaker and Hall were U of S chancellors. And that brings me to our current chancellor, Roy Romanow, who is both an illustrious alumnus who served as premier of this province and a nation builder of Canada. When Roy Romanow was Saskatchewan's Attorney General, he, along with Ontario's Attorney General Roy McMurtry, and then Justice Minister Jean Chretien, became known as the Three Amigos. That's because they worked so well together on a compromise that resulted in the Queen signing our new Constitution in 1982. And then, after only 3 months into his retirement as Premier, Roy Romanow was asked by Prime Minister Jean Chretien to become the chair of a Royal Commission on the future of health care in Canada. The Romanow Report, released in 2002, became known as a roadmap for reform and renewal of our health care system. Tonight, 2 of those amigos will take the stage. Chancellor Romanow will pose some questions to Prime Minister Jean Chretien, and then we'll open the floor to all of you. But first, I'd like to remind you about a few of the accomplishments and of the legacy of Jean Chretien, because he too is one of Canada's great nation builders. He served as the 20th Prime Minister of Canada from 1993 to 2003, serving for 3 majority terms, the first Canadian Prime Minister since 1945 to win 3 consecutive majorities. Intimately involved with all of the Liberal administrations since Pearson, he had a clear and strong feel for the national pulse, or as some have put it, a street fighter with fine political instincts. He was born the 18th of 19 children of a working-class Quebec family. His father, who worked as a paper mill machinist, was also a Liberal organizer. Mr. Chretien studied law at Laval University and joined a firm in Shawinigan, but then headed for a career in politics. First elected to the House of Commons in 1963, his lengthy experience in Parliament and Cabinet is truly impressive. In government or in opposition, he served with 6 prime ministers. He held 12 ministerial positions, including Minister for Indian Affairs and Northern Development, and he was a member of Parliament for 40 years. To do him justice in this introduction would leave little time for any real discussion or debate. He is best known, perhaps, for helping to devise and implement the federal strategy for repatriation of the Constitution of Canada and the enactment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. His governments gave Canada liberal social policies and a healthy Canadian economy, including elimination of the deficit. Mr. Chretien supported the war on terrorism but would not send troops to Iraq without UN authorization, and he introduced the Clarity Act, which set out the federal government's rules for negotiating sovereignty with Quebec. Other highlights of his wide-ranging political record include leading Team Canada missions to various countries and regions, ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, the creation of 10 national parks, a white paper on Indian policy, appointing Bertha Wilson as the first Supreme Court female justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, and introducing Millennium Scholarships for university students. Since retiring, Mr. Chretien has been involved in a number of international organizations related to advancing and world peace. In 1985, he said, "The art of politics is learning to walk with your back to the wall, your elbows high, and a smile on your face." I am going to turn the floor over to Chancellor Romano, but first, please join me in welcoming him and, to the University of Saskatchewan, Prime Minister Jean Chretien.
Mr. President, friends, Mayor Clark, I think former Premier Lauren Calvert as well is here with us, ladies and gentlemen, and above all, a big welcome to our guest of honor, the former Prime Minister, as so eloquently described by our first-rate President and his contribution to Canada. I feel, after the introduction, much like I did on occasion when I was in active politics, after an introduction that was as superb as this one was. One person in, I think it was Waukau, Saskatchewan, said, "Now that all the good things are over, here's our guest speaker, Roy Romano." And I promptly proved him to be absolutely true. Now, today's format is going to be really to turn this over to you. I will start off by asking, simply because of the large turnout, a couple of questions to get our guest, the Prime Minister, used to the answering issues. And then I would like you to start advancing your own questions. There should be microphones around. Is that or is someone carrying the microphones around? Microphone at the back there? Yes, that is and one, where else, Mr. President? And up there. So you know where the microphones are. Just make your way, and if you feel like you want to go there now, please feel free to do so. So I'm going to begin by just simply endorsing what our very distinguished President has said and extend my welcome to, I'll say my friend, former Prime Minister Jean Chretien. And I'm going to begin with one question related to federal Aboriginal government relations, because as you will all know, we are making this, our President is making this a very top priority of this university as a part of reconciliation and opportunities for everybody in Canada. Mr. Prime Minister, 2019 will be 50 years since you, as Minister of Indian Affairs in the Trudeau government, introduced the white paper entitled Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy. So the early leadership was undertaken. Maybe it could have been even earlier than that, but certainly it's a 40-year record. How would you characterize the evolution of relations between the federal and Aboriginal governments since that white paper in 1969, looking back at it today? And other microphones? There's a microphone right here.
Thank you, Roy. You know, you're quite a guy. You're not starting with the easiest one of them all. You said I was to be welcome, and here I come. I became Minister of Indian Affairs in 1968. You know, Trudeau called me and he offered me that job. And I said, I cannot do it. He said, why? He said, I never met an Indian in my life. Because I'm from rural Quebec, there was no native around central of Quebec, and I never met one, so I was truthful. So he said to me, you're the best. You don't have any bias. So you can have a fresh approach to that. And he says, you come from rural Quebec. You come from a very large family. I live as a kid in an environment where wealth did not exist. And he said to me, you might be the best. But I said no. And I went to my staff. I had a big staff at that time too. And that they said, you're making a big mistake. You should take it, but both had been working in the North as students. And they got me to change my mind, and I became Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs. So I enjoyed it. It was a very tough job. I was there 6 years, 2 months, 3 days, and 4 hours. And I enjoyed them all. After 4 years, Trudeau says, you've done enough. I will move you elsewhere, because I was traveling the land and all. I had the consultation with the natives all across Canada, and he said, that's enough, of hard work, and you have a family, so I'm moving you elsewhere. And he informed the native leaders, Walter Dieter among them from Saskatchewan, and they said, we don't want you to change him, we want to keep him. So Trudeau called me and he said, Jean, I have a problem. They want to keep you. So when I met them, I said, I'm a bit surprised you give me hell all the time, and you want to keep me. They said, because we prefer to deal with the devil we know than the devil we don't know. And, when I started, on every reserve, everything was decided by a superintendent. There was any organization to run the reserve. The superintendent was named by the Department of Indian Affairs. And the same thing in the North. The members of the Northwest Territories were appointed by the minister. Not all of them, but the majority of them. So I started to introduce band council and, install some democracy, participation of natives. And Walter Dieter came to see me and he said, we need a national organization, but we don't have any money. So will you finance us? He said, we guarantee to you, help us for 5 years, we'll not ask you 1 cent after that. So I kept my side of the deal. I think they're still paying for Indian associations. And that was the time. So the Indian policy became extremely controversial. In my consultation, because I remember here in Saskatchewan, I had one of the great moments of my career. I was in front of a group of Indian leaders, and one old leader got up and he said, thank you. He said, 20 years ago, I was invited to come to meet the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs. So I came in a canoe for 50, 100 miles, I don't know. We were waiting at the station. There was a train coming. There was a guy in the back of the train who waved at us. It was my visit with the minister. And here you are, talking with us. So, and I had all these consultations. So, what they would say to me, I had terrible press, because they would give me hell all the time. You stole our land. We live on reserves. We have an Indian Act. We have a Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. That's apartheid. I went to visit Mexico, where there's a lot of natives. There is no such a thing there. My nephew, Ambassador Raymond Chrtien, that some knew, was a junior person, Department of Foreign Affairs at the UN. And whenever he will argue about South Africa, he was told to shut up because you do the same thing in Canada. So I said, fine. I will recognize that, you know, that is a system that intellectually for me and for Mr. Trudeau was unacceptable. When I announced it to the leaders that I was saying yes to all the recrimination, I said, okay, we'll abolish the reserve, we'll abolish the Department of Indian Affairs. How many ministers abolished their own job? Not many. And, you know, you administer your land the way you want. You will be like the municipalities and running your own affairs. But they were shocked, absolutely shocked. And Harold Cardinal, who was a young, articulate leader from Alberta, called it a cultural genocide. So I backed down. I said, okay, we'll keep the reserve. We keep the Department of Indian Affairs. And we will not abolish the Indian Act. And it is the situation today. But we made a lot of progress. From the superintendent who was appointed by the minister to Band Council Indian Association. The first year I was minister, there was 12 Indians who had gone to university. Today it's thousands of them. And I was a minister who said that we should start to teach them the traditional language in schools. In some places, they were in the north, they were even classroom going trapping and so on to remember what was the life. So I introduced these things because I believe fundamentally that to be comfortable in a large society, you have to be comfortable with yourself. I am from a minority. I'm French. When I arrived in Ottawa, I could not speak English, or so little, and I had to learn it. But I always been very proud of the fact that I'm a Francophone. And everybody knows I'm a Francophone. You know, when Quebec wanted to have distinct society, I said, we don't have to inscribe it in the Constitution, because you know that I'm from a distinct society. You have only to listen to me when I'm speaking English. So I'm proud of that. Everybody knows who I am. And I wanted to develop a policy to make the native of Canada comfortable with their personality. And it is one of the great value of Canada when I'm traveling the world, that, you know, we can be different and equal at the same time in Canada. And the world needs more of that, of acceptance of diversity. You know, I'm not too happy with some of the tweets that are coming out these days, you know, that are very divisive on the name of all sorts of reasons. And we made a lot of progress. But it will take a long time to achieve an equality that might not be complete equality in a way. There's some very poor parts of Canada where the people are still there who are not native. They might be English and French, and you know, they live there, and there is no great economic opportunities, so they might have to remain poorer than the rest. But it is what is the land? We cannot all live in Toronto. It will be terrible. I don't want to live there. And I'd rather be in Saskatoon. But Chrtien is better, in my judgment. So, you know, I think we've made a lot of progress. But it's difficult to measure. And it's difficult to satisfy everybody. And in a democratic society, never everybody is satisfied. You know, we have, as I was explaining to a swearing ceremony yesterday of new Canadian, I said, you're in Canada, be proud of being Canadian. They were representing 25 different countries. You know, I said, be proud of what you are, but join us, you know. You will have the chance to be a Canadian citizen. You will have the right to vote. You can kick out government, elect governments. You can protest, but not too much. But enough to be heard and all that jazz. So it is what Canada. So I did that for many years, and it was always a preoccupation for me. And when I balanced the books, you know, and I had to cut some money going to Romano here, and the only department that I did not cut was Indian and Northern Affairs because of my past. Oh, I'm sorry. I did not cut national revenue either. Because in giving them more money, they were to collect more money. So that was a good move I made. So it's a short answer to a long question.
Well, let me make the question shorter, just a little shorter if I can. The background, if I may describe it that way, that you've set out is very important, I think, to the current situation. The current Trudeau government clearly, I think, has made Indigenous affairs a top national priority, which is what you tried to do, as you've described in your comments. And one could and his father as well, but you were the minister in charge. And I think it could be argued that, I shouldn't say this, but I'll say it this way, in modern times, you put it on the radar screen, you and the Trudeau Senior. But here we are, the current government is now making this a top national priority. It's very important to Canadians, very important to Western Canada and Saskatchewan. But the issues are much the same, it seems to me, as when you were minister and then prime minister. So, do you think that real and positive results with Indigenous partners, not quite wording this the right way, but how long will it take? Is it going to be a long operation? Can we demonstrate something now by way of accommodation and acceptance of the fact and the reality that is Canadian and Canada, as you've described? What do you make of the current initiatives?
You know, don't try to make me the mother-in-law. That's a problem of the government today. They do their best. They probably might do it differently. But they are the elected people. And they are preoccupied. They made it a high priority. And they will do their best. Of course, on a daily basis, probably I would do some of the things different. Because they're different than I was. But they made it a priority. Now they have to make progress. But I'm telling you, it will not be resolved in 2 months or 2 years. It takes time. You know, I'm coming from a minority that felt rejected for a long time. And I gave my life to national unity, to make sure that the Francophone felt comfortable in Canada. And in doing that, some of my colleagues in Quebec were calling me traitor because I was too much of a Canadian. You remember that? But I believe that we achieved a lot. When I was Prime Minister at one time, you know, we had the Governor General was Romeo Leblanc from New Brunswick. Chief Justice was Lamer from Montreal. Barry was the Chief of the Army. The clerk was Madame Bourgon. The Prime Minister, his name was Chrtien. His Chief of Staff was Pelletier. The ambassador in Washington was another Chrtien. My God. For a bunch of martyrs who were not too bad. But you know, it's when and what I'm pleased with. It's never during that time anybody mentioned that. Because everybody was occupying the job, was considered as competent to do the job. And it is the way you should act as much as possible, based on taking your place with confidence and hard work.
Get ready for the questions. I'm going to recognize momentarily, but I'll ask one more question. Those are impressive names that you just recited a half a second ago, but I didn't notice any, to be a little bit modest about it, Ukrainian names there, and I'm still waiting for something.
There was an Ukrainian from Saskatchewan who was on the other side of the table, causing me all sort of bloody problems all the time.
So it's a maybe, right? Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Let's proceed now to some questions and answers. We have right on the floor a microphone, I think it is, if I can see correctly. Please, I think the rule is just state your name and the question slowly and clearly.
Je m'appelle Patrick Wolf. I have a little story to tell, to thank two very esteemed gentlemen who have come to visit 150 Canada with us that I don't think a lot of people know, but it changed our world, and it's going to keep changing our world. In 1986, at Expo 86, Zhao Zhang made a speech saying that there was a message to be delivered to the West, that China was going to change, that the bamboo curtain was going to open, and that it needed to be presented. So in January of 1987, the chairman of the Central Institute of Nationalities, Wang Furen, came here and made a broadcast through the Education Department about Chinese relations and Chinese policies towards its relations and its nationalities. The EG5 realized what they were talking about and sent copies of it to Ottawa. And the government at the time wasn't sure what to do with it, but the government changed. And there was a continuity issue because of, different colors of ties. So what happened was the AG5 was urged at a convention of provincial people to continue a discussion with Ottawa. And the information went back to Ottawa, and then it was discovered that there was $100 billion in the United States cash sitting in reserves in Taiwan that needed dispersion. And what happened was that the government...
The question, please, yes.
Yeah, they were notified. So a letter was received from John Manley on behalf of Mr. Chretien encouraging this process incurred. And as that process incurred, that information became Team Canada and several other issues. And over the years, that has continued. But that little spark was fanned here at the University of Saskatchewan, and the person who has maintained a huge amount of dialogue is Mr. Romano. And your good government has changed the world because China has now opened its doors, and we're having incredible things happen. And it's your little letter to Mr. Manley that said, keep it up. So the world owes you a huge, huge favor and thanks for changing everything that we've done and how we've lived. So happy 150, and thank you very much, Mr. Chretien, and thank you very much, Mr. Romano.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup in English.
Дякую вам in Saskatchewan, Ukrainian, so not to make fun. All right, who's next? Is there a question at the top?
Yes.
Name, please.
Diane Rogers. And I think we all recognize Canada has built a reputation for multiculturalism and welcoming people from around the world. I know Quebec, it's maybe a little different. There's some concerns around religious identity, with the NDP looking like it may elect a Sikh who wears a turban as their leader. Do you think Quebec is going to gradually take on the same view of multiculturalism as in most of Canada, or is it going to take another generation?
I think that they, generally speaking, accept it. They live with it. Quebec is very multicultural. People are very comfortable from different groups in Quebec to live there. There is a few hot balls once in a while were in the news. But generally speaking, there is no problem because they understand that the quality of Canada is that. When I was a Prime Minister traveling around the world, you know, I was at the progressist governance meetings of leaders. There was Clinton and Blair and Schroeder and people like that. And I was always the one explaining to them how to manage immigration. You know, they had problems in Europe at that time. And I would say, in Canada, we don't have problem with immigration. I would tell them, one of the problems I have, I committed to take 1% more immigrant, 1% of the population a year. And I was not achieving it. While there, they had problem because, you know, people were afraid of immigrants. I said, when you arrive in Canada, I would say to them, you know, an immigrant is an asset. The first day he arrives, he goes to the store because he have to eat. And he buy clothing, and he buy furnitures, he buy a car, he buy a house. He is a consumer for the next 10 years. And he integrate. And one of the great things about Canada, we don't have in the big cities ghettos like they have in many parts of the world. And we accept the diversity. And they accept it in Quebec. But sometimes there is a few guys these days, and I heard on the TV lately, there is some redneck on the air in French. Little small groups who have publicity on that because they are influenced probably from the South. And the same thing arrived apparently in Alberta not long ago. Some groups from the, you know, some call them white supremacist type, who are starting to talk. But it's against the will and the tradition of Canada and of Quebec. So I think that Quebec accepts the diversity very well. I never hear any problem in my daily communication when I'm home, you know, about having problems with the diversity of Quebec, like of Canada. But it's not everybody who accepts it. In a society, in a democratic society, there is always people who will stir up the pot, as they say, once in a while. And it's part of the game.
Could I just, before you ask a question, could I just pick this up? In Quebec, what do you read is the current political situation? When you and I were around, we obviously had Mr. Levesque and the first referendum on the question of independence. Then, of course, Mr. Bouchard, series of bills, one introduced by you, the Clarity Act. New government for the last couple of years, several years in Quebec. What is, from your perspective and your experience and your knowledge, the mood, the political mood with respect to nationalism in Quebec? Is there any underlying current or sentiment which is existing?
There's only one statement I can make. The leader of the PQ has declared that he does not want to have a referendum early. He said not on the first term. And he will not win, so it will take a long time before we have another referendum. And the next time, the question has to be clear because of the Clarity Act. You know, because we had two referendums. One was 105 names, and the one was a word, and the other one was 80 or something. You know, and it was fuzzy as much as you can have it. Are you in favor of motherhood and against sin? I could have voted yes. And they would say, oh, but if we win, that would mean separation. But it was not what was written on the bulletin. So I passed a law. I said, next time, if you have a referendum, if you want us to recognize it, the question has to be, do you want to separate from Canada? Every poll, when the question is asked that way, the answer is no. So it's why they invented some confusing words. But even with confusing words now, they're postponing it. And now there is some people who think that they will have no choice but to ask a clear question. and I'm relaxed. But I tend to be relaxed all the time, so.
I hope I'm not adding to your anxiety level right now, but I do want to ask this question. As you know, I was Premier when you were Prime Minister on the Clarity Act and publicly supported it. It went to the Supreme Court. I think my government was one of 2 provincial governments which intervened on the side of the federal government.
Thank you.
But you still didn't appoint me to the Senate, and then you said
Because the New Democrats were opposed to the Senate. You were tempted, and if you had joined the Liberal Party, you would have become a star.
Oh. Well, too late, I guess, in this regard. But so let me move off on that question rather quickly. Should never have tangled with them. I know the last 15, 20 years we've been tangling. So I have another question right at the back, please.
Okay. Jack Hilson, I'd like you to take you both back to the...
Jack was a member of the Legislative Assembly, by the way, very distinguished member, and I'm proud to say a very good cabinet minister in our government, Jack. Nice to see you.
Okay.
Question.
I'd like to take you both back to patriation. As you know, the most controversial part of patriation was the compromise of the Notwithstanding Clause, which some feared would be very big. It seems as if with the passage of time it's been somewhat irrelevant. But I'd like to get the views of both of you. Is notwithstanding an important part of the Constitution, or was it simply a compromise forced on you by the premiers?
No, it was the question. I had a debate with Mr. Trudeau on that. Because Trudeau did not want to have the Notwithstanding Clause, you remember. And until he died, he was not happy with that. But there was a fundamental question about it. If you don't have a Notwithstanding Clause, the Supreme Court judgment are above Parliament forever. And in that democracy, I felt that there should be a way, if a court was to go too far, for those who are elected can have the last word. And the Notwithstanding Clause, we can see we can discriminate for this and that reason. We have to explain it, and we have to renew it every 5 years. And now, 35 years ago, the federal government never used the Notwithstanding Clause. I think you in Saskatchewan used it once.
Not my government, but another government.
I talk about Saskatchewan.
Yeah, well, okay. I'm talking about Saskatchewan under good governance, but leave that aside.
You have a point.
Okay.
And so, you know, that was a reason. And eventually, it was not, and I said to Trudeau, if we don't accept it, it's fine with me, you know, but you won't have a constitution. You know, you ask me to go ahead and hit my head on the wall, I do it. But it's in brick, and I cannot break it. We have to go around it. And eventually he accepted it. Theoretically, he was not completely happy with me or with you. But he was very happy that we patriated the Constitution and a Charter of Rights that was not in his mind perfect. But perfection is very rare in public life. Yeah. Don't you agree?
I agree, and I would say that Premier Blakeney, who of course was the Premier and therefore key in making
your
the decisions, my boss in more ways than one, he did not like an entrenched Charter of Rights and Freedoms because, as the Prime Minister has indicated, this would mean a shift over to the appointed judges. And he believed that there had to be a compromise, and I kind of shared the view, between judicial interpretation under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which becomes, in effect, an amendment to the Constitution, the interpretation. And that's difficult to undo, so you got to find the compromise. And if I may say so with the grace and respect, the Prime Minister here has described it perfectly. There were a lot of things in that particular late night meeting and our negotiations with his compromise. But what the heck, this is Canada, and we do compromise. And maybe this is a reflection of the Constitution. Now, I have a questioner at the top, and I'll come back to the floor. Yes, sir, you're up there.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Mackenzie Kibler. I'm a Master of Public Policy student at the Johnson Troyama School here at the University of Saskatchewan. Former Prime Minister, your government was one that helped bring in the NAFTA free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which built on the work previously of Brian Mulroney and the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, which has seen economic development massively in the net for all three countries, especially for Canada. Now we're undergoing renegotiations on it. I was wondering if you could speak to what Canada will have to do in order to ensure that NAFTA remains, and perhaps as well on the recent roadblocks that Mr. Trump has thrown up with respect to massive, I believe, over 200% tariffs on Bombardier products in the current trade spat.
You know, I was there for NAFTA. Mulroney did the free trade with the United States. When I arrived was elected in 1993 in October the 25th. The 26th in the morning, first phone call received was from Bill Clinton. And it was on that. And he could not pass the free trade agreement to the Congress. And he didn't know if I was to keep negotiating or not, because under Turner, my party had opposed free trade. I was not candidate at that time, but I was for free trade, but I didn't have to debate. You know, that was the policy of my party, and I was not a candidate, but I was for free trade. So I said, if I need some amendment, I told him. He said, ask me, Mr. Chrétien, what you can, because I cannot pass it. And we got some compromise about water, among other things, and labor condition and environment, and he won the vote with all the Republicans and only half of the Democrats by 25 votes in the Congress. So the Republicans were all free traders. Now they have a president who is the anti-free trader. But I don't know what will be the end result, because when you deal with the Americans, the president is very prestigious. But in many ways, he does not have a lot of personal power. You can see his great success he's having these days with new bills in front of the Congress. Zero. So, but he talks a lot and tweets a bit. But he got no bill passed. So that encouraged me. Of course, you know, there will be tough negotiations. It's always tough with the Americans. But at the end of the day, you know, they have to realize the reality. And how to do that, you know, everyone has his own style. Just to please them, I'd like to finish my question, sir, my answer. It's long because it's complicated. You know, my view is, when I was Prime Minister, we had $50 billion surplus every year. This deal I made is 23 years ago. So necessarily after 23 years, you can ameliorate, add, or subtract a bit from that. But I don't know what will be the result, but we have to remain calm. And there is many ways to do that. A lot of Canadians thought that the Minister of Trade, what is his name, Bruce, again? Well, he was a friend of our former Prime Minister, and, you know, everything was to be fine. Do you remember that? Yeah. He slapped, first thing he did, the first tariff he imposed was on softwood lumber of Canada. And yesterday he imposed only a 225% trade tax on airplane. It's a hell of a good friend of Canada. And so, but at the end of the day, we balance trade with them today. So you cannot undo an omelet. You know, the car business automobile industry. That was not part of the free trade. The Auto Pact was signed in 1970. So it's, it's 47 years that we have the Auto Pact. So you cannot rebuild, the industry, the factories that existed before. And when Trump says to the people, what's going on? It's Trump who is mad at me, I guess. And it's, you cannot, he says he will give back the jobs in the car industry in Michigan. Come on. If he wants to destroy the jobs in Mexico, he might succeed. But these jobs will not be replaced by workers in Michigan. Because an employee in Mexico is cheaper than a robot. And a robot is cheaper than a worker in Michigan. And his great business friends, they will go for the robots because of the bottom line. So, they will have to come to some sense. And if they start a war on that, it will be difficult for us. But it will be difficult for them too. Yeah. So when he put the tariffs, for example, it's not us to pay the tariffs. It's the American consumer. The softwood lumber, at this time, they face problems in the United States because the wood they get from Canada is the better quality than they get from America. So the guys are complaining because they cannot have the good, hard, good wood of Canada because the quality of our products is better. I said that. When I said no to the war in Iraq, the business people got crazy in some places. And they were afraid. And they made representation to me. And I said, fine, fine. They were afraid of retaliation. I said, okay. So, gave me the list of all the goods and the services that the Americans are buying from us and they don't need. I'm still waiting for the list. Because business is business. Yeah. They don't buy anything from us they don't need, and they don't buy anything from them that we don't need. So, good sense will eventually prevail, I hope. And if it's not, it's going to be a problem. But these congressmen will face election in 18 months, or more, less than that now. Yeah. 14 months. So, but there will be a lot of news and a lot of this and that, but normally, between Canada and United States, common sense always prevails.
Now we have a long list of people waiting. I'm sorry, I can't recognize, I shouldn't say I can't, but I'm trying to recognize people at the microphone. If you just kindly make a, pardon me, and there's the line, and I'll ask, we'll try in the interest of time to make the, I'm sorry, I didn't hear, but.
I raised my hand, I told him to sit down, and that was it.
Well, okay, do you mind if we let this gentleman ask ahead of you?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, ask the question then, please, sir. Go ahead, ask the question. But can you go to the microphone so everybody can hear it? And then we're going to follow the microphone to a T, if you don't mind, just to get it moving.
I'm Gary Hansen, the last associate professor of Russian history, which isn't taught at the university here. One of the few universities in the Western world not teaching Russian history. I have a question. I was born and raised in Iowa. The 5-term governor of Iowa is the United States ambassador to China, and that's very important for grain in Iowa, for selling grain. That's an important post. And the new governor of Iowa is the first woman, a very able woman, Kim Reynolds. And Iowa is doing well, but the one tragedy is 98 out of 99 counties have no First Nations or Indians. They were all kicked out. One county, Payne County, is the only one. I've never seen one when I was growing up in Iowa. And can something be done? Every farmer in the river valleys has collections of arrowheads and hammers and Indian things. Maybe something in the fair, state fair or something, bringing some of Canada's Indians down there, First Nations, to perform and see what they're missing.
Well, I'll just simply say that this is going to be difficult and perhaps maybe undesirable. I don't want to create a debate here. We do have treaties. We do have a different history with respect to First Nations in Canada. There are some similarities, obviously. But I just don't think that's where the stream of debate is in the Canadian model. Prime Minister, you may want to make a statement on this regard. But I think I'll go right to the next question in the lineup.
Hi, I'm Olivia Oriot. I'm a grad student here. I'm originally from Manitoba, and then I lived out east in Romeo LeBlanc country for 4 years. And I've really noticed moving here, there's just such a difference in the mood about the future of Canada. There seems like there's no consistency. It ranges from apocalyptic to this is the greatest country on earth. As a young Canadian who's hoping to build my life here and hoping to be able to build the kind of life that generations before me had, should we feel optimistic about our future?
Well, I think if you're making a statement of optimism, right, about our future,
So thank you.
I totally agree. I think it's a great province and a great country. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, me. Mackenzie Stewart. I am in law school here. And so
What year in law school?
I'm in first year. I'm just a baby. So my question, I wrote it down because I was nervous. As you know, after the 1982 patriation of the Constitution, there were promises to have further conferences to discuss Indigenous rights and entrenching them further into the Constitution. As we know, the courts have attempted to deal with this gap. I mean, they failed by using Section 35 of the Charter. Do you think this is an effective solution to the issue, or should we reopen the Constitution? Thank you.
The issue is, again, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. If you just slow it down and
Sorry.
repeat the question. This may be me, but
Nervous.
no, it's okay. I'm nervous too. Not because of you, but.
Basically, I was asking that after the 1982 patriation of the Constitution, there were supposed to be further conferences to discuss Indigenous rights and their entrenchment into the Constitution, but those failed. And subsequently, the courts have used Section 35 to determine Indigenous rights issues in Canada. And do you think this is an effective solution, or should we reopen the Constitution?
I think the question is that under the Constitution that was settled on in 1982, there was a commitment for an ongoing series of discussions with First Nations peoples in order to deal with their problems. And we've basically, these are my words, not yours, have not responded at all. And the implication seems to be in your question that this is something which needs to be taken up with more vigor. Would that be a fair way of describing it? Yes. What do you say?
But I don't know. You know, we established the principles of the natives in the Constitution for the first time in the patriation of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights. That's the guiding. Of course, there are discussions on what should be done to progress for the natives in the Canadian society all the time. You know, it's become a big priority for this government. There is ministers traveling the land all the time on that. There's discussion with the native organization all the time. They have conferences all the time in Canada on that. So should we have another constitutional conference on that? We don't need it. The problem is not a constitutional problem. The problem is a social and it is a financial problem. It's not a question of rights. It's a question of how can we deliver the service to the natives the same way than we can do for the rest of the Canadian population. And it's not necessarily easy. And there's the social problem of the people who are natives, who don't live on reserve, who lives in the cities. When they are there, they're subject to the same laws and the same obligation and responsibilities of other citizens of that city, like in Saskatoon and Regina and so on. So we don't need constitutional discussion for that. It's a question on having the means and the interest that exists to solve the social and economic problems of these citizens who have the same rights than the others, and their particularities is they are natives, and they are very proud of it, and they should be.
If I may say so, I agree with the Prime Minister on this. I think in my limited experience and with the Prime Minister, if you have a constitutional conference, positions are articulated. And then it's difficult in public to start making amendments and changes, is what you're saying. And very often, the practice of it, if there's an atmosphere, both economically by way of policy and social programs, you're likely to start making progress. That doesn't mean we may not need to make constitutional change down the road, but I think they started off probably positions everybody into firm, non-negotiable positions. And goodness knows the Prime Minister has been involved in that when, well, I was there as co-chair with him. So that would be kind of a little qualifier I put on your question. You're next, sir.
Hello. Oh, sorry. My name is Dallas Pelly. I'm a former undergraduate student here at the university.
Yeah, Dallas, just move the microphone back a little bit.
What? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Former undergraduate student in a college of education. First off, I just want to say I'm a little bit fanboying right now because growing up, you were the Prime Minister. You were the guy that I listened to on the radio, and now here you are. So I'm like,
well, what about the guy who had his premier when you were growing up?
I didn't listen to AM radio. Sorry.
What did he say?
I don't know. But I don't know what you said, but I'm not going to intervene anymore. I'll tell you that. So start up. Sorry.
Sorry. So my question relates back to the history of Canada. So moving forward, as this is a 150 event, that we're moving forward in what the now Prime Minister calls it in the restoring a nation relationship. Just thinking back now to, I had the privilege of attending the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in April, where Ms. Carolyn Bennett removed all objector status for Canada in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So I guess my question is around Indigenous Aboriginal title to the land. If we're talking about de facto sovereign nations and that we're restoring those relationships, what implications does that have when Trudeau and the government says that they are fully implementing UNDRIP in things like free prior to informed consent and the issues that would arise for the economic interests of this country, say for a pipeline going across our country. If First Nations people are the de facto, this is our ancestral land. As an Indigenous person, I know that we have the title to the land. And so if we oppose that, and if that's our right, how will that play out now in the next 150 years? How can we move forward truly in that nation-to-nation relationship? Thank you.
But, you know, my view is that what is the title and where? There was some treaties that were signed with a very defined piece of land representing the treaty that was signed by the parties. There was no treaty signed for the Métis that we consider Aboriginal today. They were not recognized in those days. And how to define, you know, the president of the university said we're on Indian land here. And when I'm in Ottawa, they say we're on the Indian land and Parliament of Canada. Fine, but, you know, but is it only symbolic or it's real? If it is real, what the hell we're doing here, it should be your building where we are. So there is a lot of, you know, we have to be very serious using words in that because that could create a lot of problems. And now, if we stop all developments because of native rights, fine. But the economy will pay for that. And there will be less money to solve the social problems that we have to solve, to pay for education and for Medicare of every citizen of the land. So we have to find the proper balance. sometimes the rhetoric is going too far. And I'm preoccupied with that. We have to be very straightforward and very clear. That's why, Walter Dieter, with me, we had very frank discussions. And he insisted to keep me, but I was able to say no. Because in government, we're not spending the money that we make. It's the money we collect from the rest of the nation. So there is some physical and financial limit to what you can do. And if we were blocking every economic development possible, every mine in Saskatchewan or in Quebec, or pipelines and other activities like that, there will be an economic price to pay. And nobody will benefit if we stop everything. So everybody has to be reasonable and don't stop our progress based on this sometimes very ill-defined notion that we don't know exactly what it is. I don't think that the Parliament of Canada is on foreign line. It is. It is the Parliament of the whole Canada. And it's why we have to be careful with the choice of words. It's my view, because you create expectations that way that cannot be met, and it is not very recommendable.
I'm sorry, I'm going to recognize the next person, if you don't mind. I'd like rebuttals, but we're running out of time. Yes, sir?
Hello. My name is Alex Bishop. I'm a second-year General Arts and Sciences student here. I was wondering what your thoughts are about the electoral reform promised during the Liberal election. Some people are upset that it hasn't really been advanced at all yet, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on it.
But everybody talks about reforming everything all the time. But I will tell you one thing. The electoral system we're having in Canada is working quite well since 150 years. And we have been able to change governments. Liberal, conservative, NDP, whatnot, or Socrates, they were replaced with our system. We inherited that system from the Brits. Churchill said our system is terrible, but it's the best. You remember he said that. So, I had problem to understand some of the reforms. You have to know exactly what you want to achieve. If the goal is to make sure that you have minority governments all the time, fine. But sometimes these systems don't work. Jim Bolger, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, introduced the proportional representation system in New Zealand. He's a member of Interaction Council that I was a president for 9 years. I meet him every year, and he always tells me it is the biggest mistake I ever made in my life. And he did it. But since that time, they make life very difficult to govern. You can. There's some countries in Europe who always govern with minority governments. You can. But I'm not sure that it is the best way. I think that when you look at our system, I think it has worked pretty well. But I'm suspicious of a lot of people who cannot get elected dog catcher would like to find a way to get into Parliament by the back door. That sometimes when I hear this debate is that. How can I go there but not have to be elected in a district? I will represent the party, is fine. It will be the establishment of the party who will select the members. I prefer a member who has to be elected in a riding, who has to go and knock doors, who have his friend to put signs, to collect the money to be elected, to receive help from his electors when he gets out on weekends, than to have somebody, university professor, who suddenly wake up in a caucus somewhere.
I have a question up there that is, the question's been waiting for a little while. If you'll hold on, please, sir. Yes.
I think I'm in university here, so some of you understood me.
Well, it's a free speech location. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm an international studies major. My question is a short question, but I'm hoping for a really insightful answer. Looking back on your time as Prime Minister specifically, is there anything that you would change and why?
Oh, why should I spend time about it? I had enough problems when I was there. You know, I did my best. And, you know, sometimes you reflect, I should have done this and done that, and, but it's a waste of time. You know, of course, I tried to convince Romano to become a liberal, and I failed.
And I bet you're happy
Because
about
he was
that now.
afraid of his friends in Saskatoon. So, you know, I don't want to lose time on that because I have you know, yes, many things I would have done differently, but I did not do it differently. So it was done, I did my best, and people decided, they elected me 3 times, and of course, in my riding, you know, I was elected twice, 12 times. I remember I voted for against capital punishment. One of my best friends gave me hell, it was unbelievable. And he was a very articulate guy. I said, vote against me if you're not happy. He said, yes, but you're the best we can have, so I will vote for you anyway, but you were wrong. So it's fine. That's the way democracy works. And I made some mistakes, but I don't want to admit that too much. And, but I'm happy that at the end of the day, after 40 years, I've done my best with the quality that I had received when I was born.
Now, I think that's true. Now, we are running out of time. I'm going to accept 2 questions, one up there, and you, sir, will be the last one, if that's okay. Yes, please.
My name is Kyla Kitzel. I'm a politics and history student, and I want to be a politician one day. So I think that rhetoric is really important, and I've learned in a lot of my politics classes that rhetoric is important, which you have continued to talk about tonight. So I'm wondering if you think it's problematic at all, your continued use of the word Indian outside of the context of policy, where I've learned that it should stay.
I didn't hear that. Could you just rephrase that, please, because
Well, you continue to use the term...
a little slower is the way.
Okay, sorry. Using the term Indian or natives is not politically correct. Indigenous or Aboriginal would be the right way to go, as far as I understand. So I'm curious why you continue to use those terms.
You know, I'm sorry, you know, to be politically correct is very difficult when you have been in politics 50 years.
Fair.
Now, to give you an example, you know, the name change, it was, you know, for example, I'll give you an example. Eskimo became politically incorrect. So they became Inuits. But for me, I was used to call them Eskimo, and the press would give me hell because I was using the word Eskimo. And, but some Indians, Eskimos, did not want to be called Inuits. They were calling themselves Eskimo. So it was a bit difficult, you know, to be always politically correct. And now I realize that what was bad with the word of Eskimo. The word of Eskimo means the people who eat raw fish. So now we all go to sushi bars. So we're all Eskimos. You know, so what is politically correct is difficult. An Indian, a native, First Nation, and, you know, there's a period which is changing. So suddenly you wake up and you're 10 years late. So as I say, it's like ties. You know, if you keep them long enough, they come back at the proper ties every 10 years.
Every 10 years.
So it's difficult to say, is it better Indians? You know what I mean when I say the word Indians. I don't want to offend anybody about that. In reality, in Indians, it should be someone living in India. But somebody made a mistake. They thought he was arriving in India and he arrived in Canada. And they became the Indians. But it's not insulting. My name is Chrétien. You know, if I were a Muslim, I would have a problem. Because I was baptized Chrétien,
Meaning Christian.
that means Christian, you know, so for those who don't know French. No, we have all to repeat all what I said in French because we're in a bilingual nation here. It would be politically correct to repeat it all in French now.
Now, Prime Minister, I'm going to recognize the last questioner here. Yes, sir.
My name is John Courtney. I'm a retired professor of political science here, and I'm sorry, I'm not a professor who ever aspired to enter politics, but I taught political science. I have a question to ask you. You have met many, many world leaders over the years in conferences, international meetings, and things of that sort. Who stands out, in your view, as some of the best that you met, and for what reason?
It depends on the angle you look. You know, the most impressive leader I ever met was to meet Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, who spent 25 years in jail to fight apartheid. So when you meet him, it's very emotional. You know, I met a lot of leaders in the 40 years. Some were very impressive in many ways, but it's difficult. You know, some I knew better than others. And so to try to characterize them is very difficult. One thing that I noted is most of the leaders in the world came from the grassroots, from the real people. For example, Yeltsin was the son of a farmer who lost his fingers with a dynamite stick on the farm of his father. Schroeder never knew his father, was killed during the war, and they discovered where he was killed and buried after he became chancellor. Bill Clinton, when he was born, his father had died a few weeks before in a car accident. His mother remarried, apparently, and the new husband was terrible. And apparently at 15, he beat the hell out of him because he was beating his mother. So it's very simple people. John Major, one of the moving moments of my life, I was at the summit of the G7 in Halifax. And I had invited some artists of the Cirque du Soleil to give them a show, you know, to welcome them. And I was informed that there was one member of the circus who wanted to meet John Major. I asked why. He said because his father was a friend of John Major's father. John Major's father was working in a circus, like his father. So it was very moving when I introduced this English guy whose father was a friend of John Major's father. And John Major was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the son of the friend of his father was still working in the circus. So it's like that, you know. In fact, the only real blue blood I met in that game was George W. Bush. And I had to say no to him. So that is, you know, it's difficult to find. Everybody has a lot of quality. And everybody, they had to be elected. They had to work to move up there. You know, some are lucky. They arrive at the top. You know, for me, I had to be 9 times elected as a member of parliament before I became prime minister. You know, I'm one of the rare. During the last campaign, people would say that Trudeau had not enough experience, and I would say, yes, but he had been at least elected twice. You know, because, you know, Mulroney was elected Prime Minister, had been elected in a by-election a year and a half before. Kim Campbell had been elected once. Harper elected once. Joe Clark elected once. At least Justin, his father had been elected only once before he became Prime Minister. At least Justin had been elected twice. Only me had to wait 9 times to become Prime Minister.
I know
so
the
I had to
feeling.
work hard to be here today.
I know the feeling a bit. Ladies and gentlemen, we've exceeded our time. I want to apologize, first of all, for not bringing in as many of you into the conversation as we're waiting at the microphones and the like. But I hope that you agree with me that in the Right Honorable Jean Chretien, we have had a marvelous lead-off speaker, contributor to this wonderful series celebrating Canada 150 here under the leadership of our distinguished president, Stoichev, and accompanying academics. I want to say to you, Prime Minister, that in the years that I've known you, which probably about 35 years, hard to believe, right? Hard to believe that a liberal and a socialist would be getting along like that, so, well, more or less getting along in any event. But it's 35 years, and your service to this country, even for those who might not agree, was distinguished by honesty, hard work, common sense, and always the goal to improve the quality of life everywhere. You have launched this series of 150 magnificently, and we wish you and your marvelous partner, Eileen, and family continued good health and continued service to the betterment of Canada. God bless you, and thank you very much for coming.